because the thing that's causing the issue persists, or whether it's because the feedback loop that's supposed to turn inflammation off doesn't work, inflammation remains mounted. And that chronic inflammation is causally associated with various different conditions. So if we were to talk about diabetes, for example, excess body fat can, through a variety of very complex mechanisms, increase inflammation. What that inflammation can do is it can interrupt normal insulin signaling. So what can happen is that blood sugar cannot be stored as effectively in various cells. This leads to increased insulin production all the time, blah, blah, blah. We all know the mechanism by which type 2 diabetes arises. If you look at cancer, one thing that inflammation can do is it can increase cell proliferation. So you've got damaged cells because you've got a thorn stuck in them. What your body needs to do is it needs to scavenge away all of the broken cells, and it needs to produce new cells like scar tissue and all of that good stuff. And every time you create new cells, what happens is one cell duplicates its DNA, and then the cell divides, and now you've got two cells with the same DNA. Every time you do that, there's a risk that DNA replication can be ineffective. And so every time you get cell proliferation, you run the risk of a copy error. That copy error can lead to the eventual downstream effects that lead to tumor growth, and that leads to cancer.
The infection, which is why a lot of the time you can't just take blood tests off at face value. They're showing you something that is underlying that can either be the result of your lifestyle, your behavior, your actions over the last few months, or acutely. And at the same time, like, I'm all for blood tests, but what's the whole point of you getting a blood test if you're not willing to actually address the root cause of the issues that you are now seeing on the blood test results? It's almost like saying, okay, I'm going to band-aid the hole in the ceiling when it's leaking water up there, but that leaking water is still going to cause damage elsewhere because you haven't actually turned off the tap or whatever it is that's causing the leak. So the band-aid approach isn't going to work. Now, as Tom was talking about, like, the inflammation response, inflammation can cause cell death in a negative way. Inflammation can also cause it in a positive way, which is exactly what exercise does. That is what you want autophagy. People talk about fasting and all this other bullshit for autophagy. Well, exercise does just that. And a big component that a lot of people are missing is that fat cells are toxic. They're not inert. They are sites. They're garbage bin disposal sites of toxins in your body. Too many of them is inflammatory. Being overweight is inflammatory in itself. Like, being over fat, I should say, is inflammatory in itself. So, like, inflammation is such a broad topic that you can't just condense it down into what foods are causing inflammation, what foods are not. Told that we should be consuming coconut oil when coconut oil is actually inflammatory. It is a saturated fat, albeit the fact that it is a medium chain triglyceride, so it doesn't put the same effects into the body that like other saturated fats do. Like, butter is one of the worst saturated fats that you can consume, and I'm sure that Tom can ramp on about this, which is why I'm very on top of telling my girls as well to minimize, if not eliminate, butter from their foods. Like, of course, a little bit here and there isn't going to be detrimental, but butter in itself, I remember seeing Dr. Spencer Nadolsky doing a self-experiment in having butter every day, and his blood panel markers, they were terrible. His cholesterol went through the roof, and all these other blood, like triglycerides. If you want to talk about inflammation, talk about butter, talk about...
So during exercise, if you're trying to build muscle, I think I said this last time, there are three primary mechanisms that lead to muscle growth after you exercise. You've got the mechanical tension, so literally just lifting weights. You've got the micro trauma that occurs within the muscle cells, which kind of dissipates once you get used to training. And then finally, you've got all of the cellular signaling, and inflammation is a big part of that. To the point that if you take anti-inflammatories after exercise, it blunts the hypertrophy response. So yeah, whenever someone talks about inflammation as this blanket negative, just remember that every time that person that talks about inflammation as a blanket negative goes to the gym and lifts weights, they're intentionally creating inflammation, whether they know it or not. So when it comes to seed oils and whatnot, this is mostly on lipid peroxidation. People with high omega-6 fatty acid diets do not have elevated levels of the things you would expect, things like cancer, again, once you control for other variables. And this is where, if we want to talk about nutrition and inflammation, and Ruby, I'll let you jump in a second, we want to talk not about foods, but about broader dietary patterns.
We'll say that seed oils or whatever it is, omega-6s, they're inflammatories, because a lot of the people that get the out of ratio omega-6 to omega-3s, because most of the food that they eat is processed, it's takeaway, it's fried foods, it's packaged foods, and they're not really the best source of omega-6 or seed oils. That is manufactured manufactured crap. Like if you're putting fresh pressed seed oils onto your food, that isn't going to cause inflammation. Now, going into this, dairy is inflammatory, gluten is inflammatory. Well, it depends. Is that although it's high in saturated fat, something about dairy does not have the same inflammatory response as when I say dairy, I'm not talking about butter.
The thing that you mentioned was the people with a high omega-6 diet tend to have problems, but when you think about it, they're eating lots of packaged foods and stuff. That's the point that I was kind of get at when I was looking at the broad dietary pattern, because at that point it's like, well, okay, but is it the omega-6 then, or is it this broad issue? And that leads us into the dairy thing, which I think is really interesting, right? Because butter and cheese are basically the same food. But if you compare the lipid response to acute consumption of both, it's radically different. And that's because while they contain the same fatty acids, the difference is in something called the food matrix. So that's like all of the other stuff that's in the food in the specific way that it's in the food. Cheese and the saturated fat in butter, it's the same, but if you look at like the molecular level of cheese, which would be a weird thing to do with your afternoon, the proteins are still there, and those proteins are still attached to the lipids, and that seems to affect the way that it alters our lipid profile post consumption. And so
cheese is a curdled product of milk. It's almost like saying, okay, there's the casein portion that we just got out of milk, like the casein part of milk, and then there's the yogurt, which is the cultured yogurt's cultured. That's the word. So yogurt is a cultured part of milk. Cheese is a curdled protein of milk. Butter is the separated fat of all of that, which is why it's different. It is not really a product of milk, but the separated fat in itself. And that is why it is inflammatory. So it's a completely divergent part of the milk product in itself.
Yeah, and saturated fat consumption promotes inflammation, which is always funny to me because it tends to be the people that talk about avoiding inflammation also advocate for high fat diets, focusing on lots of like coconut and cook your steak in butter and then it's madness. But it just indicates that people don't give a shit. They use inflammation in the same way that folks like Gwyneth Paltrow talk about toxins, talks about how fructose is really bad. So the reason that people suggest fructose is bad is because when you consume carbohydrates, those carbohydrates leave your small intestine and they're absorbed into the bloodstream. But before the carbs hit the bloodstream, they go through something called the portal vein directly to the liver. So when you eat carbs, they hit your liver before they hit your blood. And your liver gets first pass metabolism, meaning that your liver gets to kind of pick and choose whatever the hell it wants. Your liver's got a few different things it can do with fructose. It can just use it for energy. It can convert some of it into glucose, and then that glucose is going to enter the blood, or it can convert some of it into fatty acids. And what happens in like chronic overconsumption of a diet that includes large amounts of fructose is you can get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So your liver is getting pumped full of so much fructose that it doesn't know what to do with it, and that leads it to continually increase the amount of fatty acids that it's producing. Some of this gets stored on the liver, you get fatty liver, this can lead to cirrhosis, this can cause inflammation, and also some of those fatty acids are going to enter the blood. When fatty acids enter the blood, they leave as very low density lipoproteins, they eventually become LDL, and some of that can lead to atherosclerosis. This is the mechanism by which fructose can cause heart disease. In that we are assuming that the liver can't deal with the fructose that we're putting in, and that only happens in a calorie surplus, really. It can happen if you like artificially eat hundreds of grams of fructose a day, but you're not doing that. Nobody does.
When we're talking about fructose, you need to realize as well that fruits aren't fructose. They're a mixture of different sugars. They're fructose and glucose, fructose and sucrose.
So let's say you're not eating in a calorie surplus. Let's say you're eating at maintenance, and let's say you're relatively active because you listen to this podcast. You're probably an active person. What you're doing all the time is you are eating a bunch of carbs. Those carbs are getting stored in your body because you don't need them. And then when you exercise, your body's using them. And then in between meals, your body's using them. And over time, you stock up your glycogen stores and then you empty them a bit. If you're doing that while consuming fructose, you are going to be fine. The problem you've got is if you are inactive and consume a hypercaloric diet, then what happens is you stock up your glycogen stores, you stock up your liver glycogen, and then you keep drinking full sugar Coca-Cola. At that point, you're consuming lots and lots of fructose and placing that within a liver that's already fully stocked with glycogen because you ain't doing anything, and because you're eating plenty of carbohydrates to stock up your liver glycogen. And at that point, your liver is going to start de novo lipogenesis, and it's going to start producing these fats, and it's going to store these fats on the liver. If you're an active person, fructose is not a problem for you.
Instead of looking to reduce sugar intake per se, look to reduce added sugars. It's the added sugars that you want to be very skeptical of.